The bar on Station 7 Alpha wasn't much to look at, but James Carter wasn't there for the ambience. He nursed a glass of synthetic whiskey, watching the reflections of a dozen species in the scratched metal bar top. 3 years since he'd left Earth's Special Forces, and the galaxy had yet to show him anything as interesting as the classified missions he'd run back home. The doors hissed open, bringing with them a blast of recycled station air and a pair of figures wrapped in plain gray cloaks. James's enhanced senses picked up their fear scent immediately. The taller figure's hood slipped just enough to reveal iridescent purple skin and eyes like polished silver. An Australian, rare this far out on the rim. When 4 Drachnid mercenaries entered moments later, their scaled hands already reaching for weapons, James sighed into his drink. So much for a quiet evening. "The Queen and the Child," the lead Drachnid growled, voice like gravel in a processor. "Hand them over, and the rest of you can continue your miserable lives." The bar fell silent. James counted 13 civilians, all suddenly very interested in their drinks or the floor. The cloaked figures backed toward the emergency exit, but another pair of mercenaries appeared there, boxing them in. "Please," the Australian woman whispered, her accent making the standard galactic tongue sound like music. "We'll pay anything. Just help us reach the Freelands." The lead Drachnid laughed, scales rattling. "The bounty on your head is already more than anyone in this dump will see in a lifetime. Your Majesty, don't waste your breath." James set down his glass with deliberate care. He hadn't asked for this situation, but something about the fear in that child's posture, visible even through the cloak, sparked memories he'd rather forget. Times when no one had stepped up to help. "How about we discuss this civilized-like?" James turned on his stool, letting his own cloak fall open enough to reveal the phantom steel combat suit underneath. The Drachnid's biosigns spiked. They recognized military-grade tech when they saw it. "This doesn't concern you, human," the leader spat, but his hand had moved slightly away from his weapon. James smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "See, that's where you're wrong. I've got this condition. Doctors call it chronic intervention syndrome. Can't help but stick my nose in when I see folks breaking station law." He stood slowly, dropping a credit chip on the bar. "So how about you walk away, and we pretend this never happened?" The Drachnids shared looks, clearly recalculating odds. 6 against 1. Good odds normally, but humans had developed quite a reputation since joining the galactic community, especially enhanced humans with military gear. "The Empire doesn't forget," the leader warned, but James could smell the fear building. "Neither do I." James's smile widened fractionally. "Difference is, the Empire's not here right now. I am." The standoff stretched for 3 heartbeats before the leader snarled something in Drachnid. The mercenaries backed toward the door, keeping their weapons trained on James until they disappeared into the station's corridors. James gave them 30 seconds, then turned to the cloaked figures. "They'll be back with reinforcements. You've got maybe 10 minutes to tell me why I should stick my neck out further for a runaway queen and her kid." The woman lowered her hood, revealing features that put human models to shame. A circlet of living crystal pulsed softly against her forehead. The child, a girl of maybe 6, had her mother's coloring but human-like features. Half-breed, then. "Interesting. I am Queen Lyra of the Australian Concordat," she said, chin raised proudly despite her circumstances. "Or I was, until the Drachnid Empire decided to protect our interests by installing a puppet government. They want my daughter because she represents a legitimate claim to the throne, but also..." She hesitated, glancing at the child. "There are certain genetic factors they wish to study. I cannot allow that." James nodded slowly. "And the payment you mentioned. Access to the royal vaults, if we can reach the Freelands. Enough wealth to live like a king for 10 lifetimes. Not interested in wealth." James checked his chronometer. 7 minutes now. "But I've got a counteroffer. I'll help you, but not as a bodyguard or glorified escort. You want protection. I'll teach you to protect yourself." Both of you. No more running, no more hiding behind others' strength. Deal." Lyra blinked, clearly taken aback. The girl tugged at her mother's cloak, whispering, "He feels safe, Mama." Like starlight, a distant explosion rocked the station. 6 minutes. Why? Lyra demanded. Why offer this instead of simply taking our money? James thought of Earth, of the lessons humanity had learned the hard way. Because the galaxy's changing, Your Majesty. Time of kings and queens hiding in towers is ending. Either adapt and learn to fight your own battles, or watch your daughter grow up in a cage. Your choice. Lyra studied him for a long moment, then squared her shoulders. Very well. We accept your terms, Mr. Carter. James Carter. He checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. First lesson starts now. How good are you at running? The Queen gathered her daughter close. We've had considerable practice lately. Good. James grinned, an expression that had once made hardened soldiers nervous. Because this is going to be one hell of a race to my ship. Try to keep up. As alarms began blaring throughout the station, James led them toward the maintenance corridors. Whatever came next, at least he wasn't bored anymore. Sometimes the most interesting challenges were the ones you never saw coming. The Stellar Vagabond wasn't much to look at from the outside, a modified Terran corvette that had seen better days. But as James guided Queen Lyra and her daughter through its airlock, he smiled at their gasps of surprise. The interior was a different story altogether. Your ship, Lyra breathed, taking in the sleek fusion of human and alien technology. It's extraordinary. Rule 1, James said, securing the airlock behind them. Never judge by appearances. That goes for ships, people, and especially situations. He led them to the bridge, his fingers dancing across holographic controls. Area. Initiate departure sequence. Departure sequence initiated. A melodious voice responded. Though I should note we have company approaching. 6 Drachnid vessels just dropped out of hyperspace. Of course they did. James dropped into the pilot's seat. Princess, strap in there. Your Majesty, take tactical. The little girl, James realized he still didn't know her name, scrambled into a acceleration couch. Lyra hesitated at the tactical station. I don't. I've never. Second rule, learn fast or die slow. The ship's engines hum to life. Screen on your left shows approaching vessels. Red button targets, blue button fires. Try not to hit any civilian ships. Lyra's silver eyes widened. You want me to? The ship rocked as the first Drachnid vessel opened fire. James's hands flew across the controls, the vagabond responding like it was part of him. Either shoot back, or we all die. Your call, Your Majesty. The Queen's jaw tightened. She studied the tactical display for 2 seconds, then pressed the red button. A targeting reticle appeared. The blue button flashed as their pursuers entered optimal range. Mama, the princess called out. Remember the strategy games we used to play? It's just like that. Something changed in Lyra's posture. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, and suddenly plasma bolts were streaking from the vagabond's guns. The first shot went wide, but the second clipped a Drachnid ship's engine. Not bad, James grinned, throwing the ship into a spiral that shouldn't have been possible for a vessel this size. Natural talent or royal training. Lyra fired again, disabling another pursuer. The games. Eva loved them, so I learned to play. I never thought. Third rule. Everything is training if you approach it right. James pushed the engines harder, threading between station modules. Eva. Is it? Good name. The girl beamed despite the situation. It means life in the old tongue. 3 Drachnid ships remained, but they were falling behind as James demonstrated exactly why human pilots had earned their reputation. The Vagabond danced through debris fields that would have shredded lesser vessels, each maneuver taking them closer to the system's hyperspace point. They're launching fighters, Area announced. 16 contacts, closing fast. Lyra's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. What do? We show them why you don't corner something stronger than you are. James flipped several switches. Area. Deploy the surprises. Deploying surprises. And may I say, I still think this modification was excessive. That's why I didn't ask your opinion. James glanced at Eva. Princess, you might want to close your eyes for this part. Behind the vagabond, dozens of tiny objects scattered into space. The pursuing fighters flew right into them, triggering a cascade of electromagnetic pulses that turned the sophisticated craft into very expensive debris. Lyra stared at the tactical display. That shouldn't be possible. Those fighters had shielding. Fourth rule. Impossible is just a word people use when they don't want to work harder. James aligned them with a hyperspace point. Area. Plot us a course to the Freelands. The complicated way. Course plotted. Though I calculate a 78% chance the Drachnids anticipated this destination. Good thing we're not actually going there then. James turned to his passengers as the stars began to stretch. Time for some honest talk. The Freelands are compromised, probably have been for months. We need somewhere they won't expect, somewhere we can train properly. Lyra unbuckled herself from the tactical station, moving to check on Eva. You have somewhere in mind. Ever heard of Earth? The Queen's silver eyes widened. The human homeworld. But it's restricted to most non-humans. The paperwork alone. James laughed. Fifth rule. Paperwork is for people who follow rules. I've got friends there, people who understand the value of preparing for the unexpected. Plus, it's the last place the Drachnids would look for you. It's also the first place they'll look for you, Arya pointed out, given your rather colorful history with their empire. Details. James waved a dismissive hand. Besides, that unpleasantness with the ambassador's daughter was totally justified. How was I supposed to know she was allergic to chocolate? Eva giggled, the sound bright against the ship's humming. I like him, Mama. He's funny. Lyra stroked her daughter's hair, considering. This training you mentioned, what exactly will it involve? Everything. James' expression turned serious. Combat, strategy, survival skills, even politics, but done right this time. No more hiding behind ceremony and protocol. The galaxy's changing, and you need to change with it. And what do you get out of this? Really? James was quiet for a moment, watching the swirling chaos of hyperspace. Let's just say I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked. The Drachnids think they're entitled to whatever they want, just like too many others out there. Sometimes, the galaxy needs a reminder that strength isn't about size or numbers. So this is about revenge. This is about balance. James turned back to them. Humanity learned its lessons the hard way. We were nearly wiped out twice before we got our act together. Now we're out here, and we're seeing the same patterns starting again. Maybe helping you too is a small thing in the grand scheme, but every avalanche starts with one stone. Eva tugged at his sleeve. Will you teach me to fly like that? That and more, Princess. But first, he grinned. How do you feel about obstacle courses? Lyra groaned. I'm beginning to regret this arrangement. Sixth rule. Regret is just motivation wearing a fancy mask. James stood, stretching. Area. How long to Earth? Approximately 48 hours, assuming we don't have to evade any pursuit. Perfect. Just enough time for basic physical conditioning. He headed for the ship's gym. Coming, Your Majesty. Or should I start calling you recruit? Lyra muttered something that definitely wasn't proper for royal lips, but she followed. Eva bounced along beside them, seemingly delighted by the whole adventure. As they walked, James allowed himself a small smile. He had a feeling these two were going to surprise a lot of people, themselves included. Sometimes the best way to protect someone wasn't to stand in front of them, but to teach them to stand on their own. And if they happened to bring down an empire in the process, well, that was just a bonus. Earth's gravity felt like a lid blanket to Lyra and Eva after 2 weeks in space. James watched them struggle to maintain proper form during their morning exercises in his family's private training compound outside Seattle, where the misty mountains provided both cover and challenge. Again, he commanded, as Lyra attempted another hand-to-hand combat sequence. Your body remembers even when your mind is tired. That's the point of all this repetition. Lyra wiped sweat from her brow, her purple skin shimmering in the early morning light. Is this how all humans train their children? Nah, James grinned, correcting her stance. This is how we train our special forces. Speaking of which, he glanced at Eva, who was practicing with a child-sized training drone. Your daughter's got natural talent. The drone whirred and swooped, firing harmless light beams that Eva dodged with increasing confidence. Her movements had a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a 6-year-old, human or Australian. It's in her blood, Lyra said quietly. The real reason the Drachnids want her. Our bloodline carries certain abilities. Yeah, I figured there was more to it than succession rights. James threw a punch, which Lyra blocked correctly this time. Want to tell me what we're really dealing with? Before Lyra could answer, Aria's voice cut through the morning air. Multiple contacts detected in orbit. Drachnid signatures. James's expression hardened. How many? 3 capital ships, plus support vessels. They're deploying dropships. I estimate 15 minutes until they breach atmospheric defense protocols. Impossible, Lyra breathed. How did they find us so quickly? Questions later. Survival now. James activated his comm. Area. Initiate protocol Ghostwalker. Eva, to me. The little girl ran over, her eyes wide but focused. The training drone folded itself and attached to her back like a small backpack. Remember the emergency routes we practiced? James asked her. Eva nodded. Good. You and your mother take the mountain path. I'll handle our visitors. No, Lyra said firmly. We're not running anymore. You taught us better than that. This isn't a training exercise, Your Majesty. Those ships carry elite hunter teams. 7th rule. Lyra quoted back at him, a fierce smile on her face. Never waste good training. James stared at her for a moment, then laughed despite the situation. Well, Dan, looks like you've been paying attention. He checked his weapons. All right, new plan. Eva, remember that special talent your mom mentioned? Time to see what you can really do. The girl's silver eyes seemed to glow. Like the stories about the ancient queens. Exactly like that. James tapped his communicator. Area. What's their dispersion pattern? 3 primary landing zones, each approximately 5 kilometers apart. They're creating a containment triangle. Standard hunter protocol, Lyra noted. They'll sweep inward, leaving no escape routes. James nodded approvingly. So what's the counter? Hit them before they're ready, Eva piped up. Like in the strategy games. Smart girl. James pulled up a holographic map. They'll expect us to run or hide. Instead, we're going to split their forces and take them apart piece by piece. But first, he looked at Eva. Think you can show us what a princess of the Australian Concordat can really do? Eva closed her eyes, concentrating. The air around her began to shimmer with an opalescent light. When she opened them again, they blazed like miniature suns. The royal bloodline, Lyra explained, watching her daughter with pride and concern, carries the ability to manipulate quantum fields. In the old days, they called it starsong. Eva's talent is stronger than any in generations. Useful. James was already calculating new possibilities. Range? About 2 kilometers at full power. But she's young, untested. Not anymore. James knelt before Eva. Remember what we practiced with the drone? Same thing, but bigger. Think you can handle it? Eva's face set in determination. Yes, sir. That's my girl. He turned to Lyra. You're with me. We'll engage their ground forces while Eva provides support from the cliff observation post. Area will coordinate. The first distant rumble of dropships entering atmosphere rolled across the mountains. They have no idea what they're walking into, do they? Lyra asked, checking her own weapons with practiced ease now. 8 rule, James grinned. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't believe exists. He activated his combat suit, phantom steel flowing like liquid shadow across his body. Let's go hunting. The next 30 minutes became a lesson in asymmetric warfare that would be studied in military academies for years to come. As Drachnid hunter teams deployed in perfect formation, they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Eva, safely positioned high above, reached out with her starsong. Under her influence, quantum fields twisted and warped. Drachnid sensors failed, communication scrambled, and sophisticated targeting systems showed phantoms and shadows. Meanwhile, James and Lyra moved like ghosts through the chaos. The Queen proved she'd learned her lessons well, matching James strike for strike. Human ingenuity combined with Australian grace became a deadly dance that left heavily armed hunters broken and bewildered. Squad 3 is down, Area reported. Squad 2 is attempting to regroup at Landing Zone 2. Squad 1 has lost contact with their command ship. Status on Eva? Lyra asked, dispatching another hunter with a precision strike. Energy reading stable. She's performing admirably. James threw a neural disruptor into a group of confused Drachnids. Tell her to focus on their command and control systems. Keep them blind and scattered. Above them, Eva's power flared like a newborn star. Drachnid dropships suddenly lost power, their emergency systems fighting phantom failures. Combat suits designed to make their wearers apex predators now acted like prison cells. This is impossible. A Drachnid commander's frustrated roar carried across the battlefield. They're just 3 targets. How are they doing this? 9 rule, James muttered, moving in for the kill. Impossible is just the beginning. As the morning sun climbed higher, the would-be hunters learned a harsh lesson about underestimating their prey. Of the 60 elite troops deployed, none made it back to their ships. The capital ships in orbit, faced with inexplicable systems failures and the sudden appearance of Earth Defense Force vessels, retreated in disarray. Later, as they watched the last Drachnid ships vanish into hyperspace, Eva curled up in her mother's lap, exhausted but proud. "Did I do good?" she asked sleepily. James looked at the aftermath of their victory, at the proof that all his lessons had borne fruit. "Kid, you did amazing. But this was just the beginning." "They'll be back," Lyra stated, stroking her daughter's hair. "Of course they will, with bigger ships and better troops." James smiled, the expression both fierce and pleased. "And we'll be ready. Because now they know what they're really dealing with, and fear is a powerful teacher." Eva yawned. "What's Rule 10? "Rule 10, James considered for a moment. Never stop learning. Because out there somewhere, someone's always getting stronger. Our job is to stay one step ahead." As they headed back to the compound, James already had plans forming. The Drachnids would indeed return, probably with enough firepower to glass a continent. But by then, his students would be ready for the next lesson. After all, humanity hadn't survived its own trials by playing it safe. Sometimes the best defense was teaching others how to bare their teeth and fight back. And from what he'd seen today, the galaxy wasn't ready for what an Australian queen and princess could do with a little human instruction. The real war was just beginning. A month after their first victory, the underground bunker beneath James's compound hummed with activity. Holographic displays showed fleet movements across 3 sectors of space, each marked with Drachnid signatures. They were gathering forces, preparing for something big. "They're getting desperate," Lyra observed, studying the tactical overlay. Her combat suit, now customized with both human and Australian tech, gleamed in the dim light. 3 battle fleets just to catch us. Not just to catch us. James manipulated the display, highlighting energy readings. "These patterns, they're not hunting anymore. They're afraid." Eva sat cross-legged in the center of the room, her eyes closed in concentration. Around her, quantum fields twisted reality itself into abstract patterns. "They should be afraid," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "I can feel them, you know. All their ships, their machines. They're so noisy in the quantum space." James exchanged glances with Lyra. Eva's powers had grown exponentially over the past month, far beyond their initial expectations. What had started as simple disruption of electronics had evolved into something approaching total dominion over technology itself. "Show me," James said softly. Eva opened her eyes, now permanently touched with starlight, and raised her hand. The holographic display shimmered, then transformed. Suddenly, they were seeing space itself as Eva perceived it. A vast web of quantum connections linking every piece of technology in range. "Beautiful," Lyra breathed, "and terrifying." "The old stories," Eva continued, her voice distant. "They weren't complete. The royal bloodline. We weren't just rulers. We were guardians, watchers of the quantum space." She turned to her mother. "That's why they fear us. Why they need us." "The Drachnids." James leaned forward. "They found something out there, didn't they? Something in the quantum space." Lyra's face paled. The ancient texts spoke of entities that lived between realities. The first queens used their powers to keep them at bay, to maintain the barriers between spaces. But that was considered myth, legend, not myth. Eva's voice hardened. "They're stirring now. The Drachnids. They've been poking holes, trying to reach through. They thought they could control what they found." She smiled, an expression too old for her young face. "They were wrong." James activated his combat suit's sensors, scanning Eva. The readings made no sense. Energy patterns that shouldn't exist, quantum fluctuations that defied physics itself. "Why do they need you specifically?" "Because I can see the truth." Eva stood, her small frame somehow filling the room with presence. The ancient queens didn't just watch the barriers. They repaired them, strengthened them. "The Drachnids thought they could use me to open doors. But that's not what my power is for." Aria's voice cut through the tension. Multiple quantum disturbances detected in nearby systems. "The Drachnid fleet. They're doing something unprecedented." The holographic display erupted with new data. Tears in spacetime. Rifts between realities, spreading like cracks in glass. And through those cracks, something was reaching through. "Oh gods," Lyra whispered. "What have they done?" "They're desperate," James realized. "They know Eva's getting stronger, learning to use her powers. This is their last attempt to capture her before she becomes too powerful to control." "Too late," Eva said calmly. Around her, the quantum fields pulsed with increasing intensity. "Mr. Carter, remember when you said impossible is just the beginning?" James felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you thinking, Princess?" "They wanted to use my power to open doors." Eva's smile turned fierce. "Let's show them what it's really meant to do." The bunker's sensors screamed as Eva reached out, not just with her mind, but with the full force of her hereditary power. The quantum space itself seemed to bend around her will. James and Lyra watched in awe as their young charge began to work on a scale that redefined what they thought possible. Through Eva's power, they could see the Drachnid fleet scattered across 3 sectors, could see the rifts they'd torn in their desperate gambit, and they could see what waited on the other side. Ancient, hungry things that defied description. "Time for the final lesson," Eva announced, her voice carrying echoes of her ancestors. "Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to remind your enemy why the rules existed in the first place." James finished, understanding dawning. Eva nodded. "Exactly. Watch closely, Mr. Carter. This is going to be educational." What followed was both magnificent and terrifying. Eva, channeling powers passed down through generations of Australian queens, didn't just close the rifts the Drachnids had opened. She turned their own desperate strategy against them, creating strategic quantum disturbances throughout their fleet. Ships found themselves phasing partially out of reality. Weapons backfired as quantum fields twisted around them. Communication systems broadcast the sounds of things that lived between spaces, sounds that drove hardened warriors mad with terror. "They're retreating," Lyra reported, watching the tactical display. "All three fleets. They're running." "Of course they are." Eva lowered her hands, swaying slightly. James caught her before she could fall. They finally understood what they were really dealing with. Not just a little girl they could cage and use, but the heir to powers that kept the universe safe since before their empire existed. James lifted Eva gently. "You know they'll be back. Eventually, with worse plans. Let them come." Eva's eyes drifted shut, exhaustion finally claiming her. "We'll be ready, all of us." As James carried Eva to her room, Lyra following close behind, he reflected on how far they'd come. He'd set out to teach them how to protect themselves, but somewhere along the way, they'd taught him something too. Sometimes the greatest power wasn't in knowing how to fight, but in understanding what you were really fighting for. The Drachnids had sought to control powers they didn't understand. Instead, they'd awakened something far more potent, the true heritage of the Australian queens, combined with human determination and ingenuity. The real war might still be coming, but the rules had changed. And if there was one thing James had learned in his years of combat, it was that nothing was more dangerous than an enemy who could rewrite the rules of engagement itself. Eva stirred in his arms. "Mr. Carter," she mumbled sleepily. "Yes, Princess. I think I'm ready for Rule 11 now." James smiled. "And what's that?" "Sometimes the best weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's the wisdom to know when and how to use your power." "Not bad, kid." He tucked her into bed. "Not bad at all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But for now, they had won something more valuable than any tactical victory. They had shown the galaxy that sometimes the most powerful force wasn't the biggest fleet or the strongest army. Sometimes it was simply the courage to stand up and remind the universe why certain powers were meant to protect, not destroy. 3 months after Eva's demonstration of power, the Drachnid Empire launched its final gambit. Not with warships or quantum experiments, but with words. "A peace summit," James read from the official transmission, his voice dripping with skepticism. They stood in Earth's primary diplomatic center in Geneva, where representatives from a dozen species had gathered. "They want to negotiate." Lyra, resplendent in a blend of royal Australian robes and human tactical gear, studied the proposed terms. Full recognition of Australian independence, withdrawal of all forces, official apologies. She looked up. "It's too good to be true." "Of course it is," Eva said. At 7 years old now, she carried herself with the gravity of someone far older. The constant quantum energy around her had left its mark. Her hair shimmered with starlight, and her eyes held galaxies. They're terrified, but they're also proud. This isn't surrender. It's their deadliest trap yet. James nodded. Question is, what's their real play? The answer came during the summit itself. The Drachnid High Command arrived in a ship that dwarfed all others in Earth orbit. As negotiations began in the Grand Chamber, Eva suddenly stiffened. "The ship," she whispered. "It's not just a ship. It's a quantum resonance chamber. They've built it around something old. Something they found in the deep void." Before anyone could react, quantum energy exploded from the Drachnid vessel. Reality itself screamed as space tore open above Earth. Through the rift came something that defied description. A vast, ancient intelligence that had waited eons for this moment. "Behold," the Drachnid Emperor's voice boomed across all frequencies. "If we cannot control the quantum space, we will unleash those who ruled it before. Let the old ones reclaim their domain." Chaos erupted in the summit chamber. Diplomats fled as reality buckled around them. But James, Lyra, and Eva stood their ground. "Really?" Eva sighed, sounding for a moment like the child she was. "They actually thought this was a good idea." James activated his combat suit. Want to show them why it wasn't? Eva smiled, and in that smile was the wisdom of generations of quantum guardians. Mom, remember what we practiced. Lyra stepped forward, her own latent powers awakening under her daughter's guidance. Together then. All of us. Eva held out her hands. Mr. Carter, remember Rule 12. James grinned as he took her left hand, while Lyra took her right. There's no such thing as too much firepower. No. Eva's power began to flow through all three of them. The strongest shield is the one forged from trust. The entity from beyond reality reached for Earth with tentacles of pure quantum energy. But it met something unexpected, a barrier born from the combined strength of three races' greatest traits: human determination, Australian wisdom, and the pure, unbridled potential of a child who had learned to believe in herself. Eva's voice echoed with the power of her ancestors. You wanted to see the true power of the quantum space. Pure energy cascaded from her small frame, using James and Lyra as conduits. Let me show you what it means to be its guardian. What followed would be remembered for generations as the quantum sunrise. Eva, channeling not just her own power but the strength of those who stood with her, reached into the very fabric of reality. She didn't just fight the ancient entity, she showed it something it had never seen before. The power of choice, of protection rather than consumption, of three different species standing together against the dark. The entity paused in its assault, confronted with something beyond its eons-old comprehension. And in that moment, Eva struck. Quantum energy erupted from the trio, not as a weapon, but as a restructuring force. The rifts began to seal, not through brute force, but through the same power that had created them in the first place. The entity found itself not destroyed, but transformed, its ancient hunger tempered by understanding. The Drachnid ship, its resonance chamber overloaded, began to break apart. But even then, Eva wasn't finished. You wanted to rule through fear, her voice carried to every corner of the galaxy. Let me show you a better way. With a gesture, she opened quantum windows throughout the galaxy, showing every species, every world, what had transpired. The Drachnid Empire's desperate gambit, Earth's steadfast defense, and the power of unity against impossible odds. The Age of Empires is over, Eva declared. The Age of Guardians begins. The Drachnid Emperor, watching his greatest weapon dissolve into quantum energy, finally understood. They had sought to cage a power that was never meant to be controlled, only guided. In their pride, they had nearly destroyed everything. In the aftermath, as Earth's diplomats began the process of reshaping galactic politics, James found Eva standing at a window, watching the quantum auroras her power had left in the sky. Not bad for 6 months of training, he said softly. Eva leaned against him, suddenly just a tired little girl again. Couldn't have done it without you. Both of you. She looked at her mother, who joined them. What happens now? Now, James smiled. Now we show the galaxy what happens when you combine human innovation, Australian wisdom, and a little girl who refused to be what others wanted her to be. The Quantum Guardians, Lyra mused, has a nice ring to it. Speaking of rings, Eva held up her hand, where quantum energy danced between her fingers. I think I'm ready for more advanced lessons. The entity, before it transformed, it showed me things. There's so much more to learn. Always is. James put a hand on her shoulder. That's the final rule, you know. The 13th rule. What's that? The greatest adventure isn't in winning the fight. It's in what comes after, building something new, something better. Eva nodded, watching as ships from a dozen worlds moved through the quantum auroras above. The Drachnid Empire had sought to rule through fear and control. Instead, they had sparked something far more powerful, the birth of a new era where the strengths of all species could combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts. And at the heart of it all, a human soldier, an Australian queen, and a little girl with the power to reshape reality had proved that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't strength or fear or even ancient cosmic entities. Sometimes it was simply the courage to trust, to learn, and to believe in something better. The quantum auroras danced overhead, a reminder that in a universe of infinite possibilities, the greatest power was the choice of how to use what you were given. The war was over, but the real adventure was just beginning. And somewhere in the quantum space, ancient entities stirred, not in hunger now, but in curiosity. They had witnessed something new, something unprecedented. Perhaps they too had something to learn from the species who had chosen to guard rather than control. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities, just the way it should be.